In 1981, 3 men vanished from a rural gas station in the middle of the night. No wreckage, no blood, not even a broken coffee cup. The lights were still on when the morning shift showed up, their jackets still hanging on the hooks. For 40 years, it sat as one of Darlow's forgotten stories, too strange to explain, too quiet to pursue. But in the fall of 2021, when a demolition crew hit steel under the old slab, they uncovered something no one had accounted for, a hidden room. And the moment I got the call, I knew it was time to go home. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this have ever brushed close to your town or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Elliot Crane, and I was born and raised in Missouri. I'm a freelance writer now, mostly long-form history pieces and investigative features for folks who still like the printed word. I keep my work quiet and deliberate like my uncle used to be. I was just 6 when David Rorick disappeared. He was my mom's younger brother, lived with us for a while after a breakup. I remember his dry laugh and the way he used to light bottle rockets off the porch with a lighter that said, "Show me state." He worked nights at the Gulf Station out by Route 6. Back then, that place was the edge of town. Beyond it, nothing but fields, train lines, and miles of dark. My family never talked much about what happened. For years, I thought that was just grief. But now I'm not so sure. Growing up, life in Darlow was steady. Everyone knew everyone. You left your car running when you popped into the diner. Halloween lasted one night, not a week. I'd ride my bike past the Gulf Station after school. By the time I was 10, it had shut down, boarded windows, pump handles, zip-tied. Just another place grown over with weeds and dust. The official story was that David and 2 co-workers, Tommy Geller and Mark Dunley, walked off the job. Left everything behind. No one said why. No one could say how. My mother cried every night that first week. Then she just stopped bringing his name up at all, and as the years rolled on, so did the town. New faces, new storefronts. The past got quieter, until October of 2021. I was packing up my apartment in St. Louis when I got a voicemail from my cousin Wendy. Her voice, cracked halfway through, said the demolition team found a hatch, steel rusted shut, hidden under concrete, right where the Gulf Station used to be. She said there were name tags inside. One of them just said David. I remember standing there for a long time, holding my phone like it might burn through my palm. That night, I didn't sleep. I dug out my old field recorder, my notepad, the cracked lens camera I hadn't used since 2017. I didn't know what I was looking for yet. But something had opened in Darlow, and I needed to see it for myself. I got there the next evening. Same faded welcome sign, same dusty side streets. Even the diner on 5th Street still had the same cash-only sign taped to the window. But at my aunt's house, things were different. The minute I walked in, she pulled me into a hug like it had been a week, not a decade. Then she looked me straight in the eye and said, "They found something, Elliot. They won't say what, but someone saw your uncle's name down there." That night, I couldn't stop hearing the house creak. Old floorboards whined in the gutter maybe, but something felt off. I climbed into the attic just to look around. I wasn't expecting to find the crate. It was half crushed under an old bed frame wedged behind dusty insulation. On the lid, written in faded black marker, David Rorick. Inside, under some papers and an old patch from his uniform, was a brown envelope. It just said, "If anything happens to me." I opened it slowly. There was no letter, just a cassette tape still in its case labeled October 6th, and a photograph. 3 men, Gulf uniforms, standing in front of the pumps, arms crossed. David in the middle. The others, Tommy and Mark, I'd later learn. On the back, in David's handwriting, "Last shift before it all changes." I took the photo downstairs and laid it on the kitchen table. The handwriting on the back felt heavier than ink. "Last shift before it all changes." I kept staring at it while the coffee went cold. I didn't know the other two men yet, but I'd soon learn their names the same way I'd learn everything else through what was left behind. What made it so hard to look at was how normal they all looked. Just three guys in work jackets outside a gas station. Nothing dramatic, nothing ominous. But somewhere between that shutter click and the morning after, something swallowed them. I started with the basics: who they were, where they lived, what they were doing that night. All three were scheduled for the overnight shift at the Gulf Station off Route 6. My Uncle David Rorick was the shift lead. He'd been working there 5 years. Quiet, steady clock punch kind of guy. Lived with my mom after a rough patch, and as far as I know, he never left a job early. Not even once. Tommy Geller was 20. Darlow Kid came back after a year at a junior college that didn't take. His mom said he was saving for a car, but his sister remembered he'd started writing in a little notebook that fall. That notebook never turned up. The third man was Mark Dunley. 25, new in town, rented a room above the old post office. Paid cash. The kind of guy who knew how to fix a carburetor, but not much about small talk. This was only his 3rd week on the job. I pieced together their last night from old incident reports and the station's call logs, some of which had survived in the zoning office basement, misfiled, never digitized. They clocked in around 10 Subdrum p.m. The last known customer came through at 1:40 a.m. A delivery driver named John Price passing through on a northbound haul. I tracked him down at a retirement complex in Jefferson City. Took a while to get him to answer the door. Once he saw the photo, he pointed to Tommy. Said that was the kid who pumped his gas. Price said everything looked normal. Lights on, register working. The kid at the counter seemed distracted, though kept glancing toward the garage like he was waiting for someone to come out. I asked if he saw anyone else. He shook his head. Said he pulled away after about 3 minutes and didn't think about it again until years later when the news spread. When the morning shift showed up just after 6, the building was lit and unlocked, but no one was there. David's truck still parked out back. Coats still on the rack. A pot of coffee still half full, warm to the touch. Their paychecks from the day before were sitting unopened on the counter. No broken windows, no blood. The till drawer was open, but nothing was missing, not a dollar. An officer arrived just after 800. He walked the perimeter, stepped inside, looked around, and radioed in a guess. Probably a prank. Maybe they'd been drinking. Maybe they'd gone out back to mess around and gotten spooked. By the time my grandfather showed up, David's father, he was furious. Said his son had a dentist appointment the next morning and had just bought new tires. He wouldn't leave the drawer open. He kept repeating. He never left the drawer open. Tommy's mother came by, too, sobbing before she even stepped out of the car. Kept saying he's not the kind of boy who runs. The station's owner, Jack Kessler, was called in next. He unlocked the office, checked the logs, confirmed the inventory. Nothing gone. Gas levels fine. No sign of a break-in. The only thing he flagged was the back storage door. It was unlatched. Normally it was bolted from the inside. Not broken, just open. That detail kept coming back. The responding officer filed the report under voluntary absence. No signs of foul play. No emergency calls. Made no reason to suspect anything criminal. The case was kicked up to the sheriff's department, then mostly dropped. No press release, no ongoing search. After the first week, it barely made conversation. Darlow was like that. Stories got quiet when there was nothing new to say. I found the original incident file tucked behind some loose sheets in a manila envelope labeled Station, Miss Key. It was filled out by Deputy Glenn Mercer, who was only a few years into the job back then. His notes were careful, not rushed. Bank accounts had no activity, no recent cash withdrawals, no packed bags, no calls made from the station payphone. The backlot was dirt and gravel. 2 nights of light rain had erased any footprints. But near the bottom of his first report, Mercer had added a line. It was handwritten, a little off-center. No sign of foul play, but doesn't feel like a walk-off. Recommend further review. That review never came. A week later, Mercer was pulled from the case. It went to Detective Calvin Price, who only did one interview with the station owner. His report was short, stated the men likely left town voluntarily, maybe for work. No follow-up necessary. Mercer didn't buy it. Years later, when I tracked him down in a house outside Osceola, he still remembered the smell of the coffee in that building, how it was warm, not burned, like someone had poured it minutes before they vanished. Said something always felt unfinished. He kept a few of his original notes unofficial off the record. In one of them, written faintly in the corner, he'd scrawled, "Feels like something under the surface here, something we weren't supposed to find." I kept that page. A few other strange threads showed up, bits and pieces the sheriff's office never pulled together. There was a woman named Georgia Lane, 43 at the time, who'd called the station just after midnight that night. She thought she'd left her purse there earlier in the evening. She talked to a man who said he hadn't seen anything but would take a look. Polite, calm. But in a recent interview, she told me she remembered a loud clanging in the background, metal on metal, and then a second voice, faint but sharp, saying, "Don't." The line went dead right after. She said she told the police she'd heard something, but not that part. She thought it sounded crazy. And maybe it did. But if she was right, it meant at least one of them was still inside that building while someone else, someone not supposed to be there, was answering the phone. There was also an unsigned statement in the old file. It wasn't on department letterhead, and the handwriting was different. It described a pickup truck with its lights off, parked behind the station just before 200 a.m. The driver didn't stop, just noted it as unusual. No name, no follow-up. It was never filed formally. I circled that in my notebook. Because even if it didn't prove anything, it was the first shadow where something solid should have been. But the part I couldn't shake was something Mercer had buried deep in a supplemental report, one that never made it to the formal record. He'd spoken with a teenager named Calvin Drake, 17 at the time, who'd been waiting outside the diner across the road around 1:15 a.m. According to Mercer's notes, the kid saw a tall man in a dark leather coat standing near the bushes behind the station. Said he wasn't drunk, wasn't staggering, just watching. About 30 minutes later, he saw the same man walk behind the garage toward the back of the building. Calvin assumed he worked there. There was no sketch, no last name filed. A note in the margin just said, "Witness underage, not sure of accuracy. No follow-up requested." But what caught my attention wasn't just that someone was back there. It was where he was seen the rear lot. The same spot where decades later a construction crew would hit a sealed steel hatch with a backhoe. The same hatch that had David's name buried beneath it. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew that man in the leather coat hadn't just wandered through. He was near something, maybe waiting for someone, maybe watching them go in. I added one more note to my file, underlined it twice. Whatever happened that night, they never left the property, and I wasn't the only one who'd started to believe it. There were questions I expected when I came back to Darlow: what really happened that night, what the police knew, what they chose not to find, but what I hadn't prepared for was just how many people had stopped asking altogether. It wasn't just silence. It was something deeper. Like the town had folded the whole thing away in a drawer and then built new cabinets on top of it. Even people who lived right down the road from the Gulf station couldn't tell me when it had shut down. They'd pass it daily and never look. That kind of forgetting isn't natural. It's made. I spent my first week working through the official files, what little remained, and even those were stripped down to the bones. No transcripts, just summaries. No formal interviews past the first few days. It felt like the story had been packed up before it had a chance to be told. When I asked around, most folks shrugged. Some had vague memories, rumors about the men leaving town, a construction job in Texas, or a woman one of them might have been seeing in Illinois. But no one could pin down a detail. Not a sighting, not a postcard, not a call home. There wasn't a single confirmed trace of David, Tommy, or Mark after October 7th, 1981. That kind of vanishing doesn't happen without somebody choosing to look the other way. The families had tried at first. My mom told me she'd driven to every town within 50 miles those first 2 weeks. My grandfather put out flyers at rest stops and truck depots, his own design, just a photo and the words, "Have you seen these men?" But when the local paper declined to run it without police verification, he stopped asking. After that, I think they all just carried the weight in private. I reached out to the sheriff's office to request copies of the follow-up from Detective Calvin Price. The file they sent back was thin 4 pages. Most of it repeated the first officer's conclusions. No signs of foul play. No motive for abduction. No escalation to criminal investigation. There was a note on the final page stating the case would remain open pending new evidence, but there was no indication that anyone had ever looked again. I asked if I could speak with Price directly. I was told he passed away in 2009. Heart failure. No known family. No one to ask. But I did track down the man who first took the call that morning. Glenn Mercer was retired now, living just outside Osceola. He was in his 60s when I found him, slower moving but sharp as ever. We sat on his porch for nearly an hour before he said anything meaningful. Not out of reluctance, more like he was still trying to decide what he'd never said out loud. When he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry, just tired. He said I knew something was wrong the second I stepped inside that building. Coffee was warm, lights were on. Felt like they'd just stepped out, but there was this stillness. Not the kind you get after hours. The kind you get when something's been interrupted. I asked why the case wasn't pursued more aggressively. He gave a long look out toward the tree line, then said, "Small towns don't always want answers. Sometimes it's easier to live in the maybe." He told me there were things he'd tried to push further. A request for deeper ground scans around the station's back lot. A follow-up on the sighting of a man in a dark coat behind the garage. Even a brief inquiry into the Gulf Station's construction permits from the 70s, he said the slab looked wrong, like it had been added later. All of it was dismissed. Budget jurisdiction, lack of probable cause. Then he got reassigned. Mercer didn't claim conspiracy, he didn't spin theories, but he looked me in the eye and said, "You don't seal something up unless you're afraid of what's inside." He handed me a box from a back closet before I left. Inside were his old notes, handwritten pages he hadn't filed officially. One was a list of early tips that never got follow-up. At the bottom was a name I didn't recognize, Calvin Drake, 17 at the time. It took some digging, but I found Calvin living outside St. Joseph. I didn't expect much. 40 years dulls most memories, but when I showed him the picture of the station, something in his eyes clicked. He was quiet for a minute, then told me about the night he was waiting for his cousin to finish a kitchen shift at the diner up the road. Around 1:15 a.m., he stepped out back for a cigarette and noticed someone across the road. Tall man, leather coat, standing near the bushes behind the station, just standing there. Not moving, not looking around. Calvin assumed he was waiting for someone. He said he saw him again, maybe 30 minutes later, walking along the back of the garage. No light, no sound, just a figure with purpose. He told Mercer about it, but the statement never made it into the file. The note said he was underage. They didn't think it was credible. But Calvin never forgot. And now, with the hatch uncovered in that exact location, it meant whoever that man was, he wasn't passing through. He was already there, and he was watching. I started to notice how many things never made it into the file. Not just the coat, not just the backlot truck. There were other calls, other hints, like a brief mention of a fire at the property 12 days after the disappearance. It wasn't flagged as relevant, just listed as non-criminal property loss. But it burned the small shed out back where old station documents had been stored. And there was no investigation, no report of arson. Just gone. It felt like every time I found something that should have been a thread, the other end had been cut. And the more I asked, the quieter things got. I stopped by the planning office to review old construction permits. The clerk at the desk barely looked up, said she couldn't find anything recent or old for that matter, but when I mentioned the slab, she got tight-lipped. Told me if I wanted access, I'd need a formal request from the county. I left without pushing. I'd been in places like that before where the silence was policy, not oversight. Later that night, I went back to the attic and re-examined everything. Spread out the photos, the envelope, the cassette. I stared at David's name written on the tape. October 6th, one day before the disappearance, and still sealed after all this time. I hadn't played it yet. I wasn't sure I was ready. But something about the way people had refused to look the way they still avoided eye contact when I mentioned that station, it made me feel like maybe what scared them wasn't just that the men vanished. Maybe it was that someone had heard something they weren't supposed to. I set the cassette on the desk. The recorder was already plugged in. I didn't press play. Not yet. But I was getting close. I finally played the tape 2 days after I found it. I'd been putting it off, circling it like it might say something I wasn't ready to hear. But that morning the house was quiet and I didn't feel like waiting anymore. I brought the recorder out to the sunroom, pressed the play button, and just listened. The first few seconds were nothing, just the low hiss of worn tape. Then came the sound of someone clearing their throat, followed by a nervous voice trying to keep it together. "Okay, this should be rolling now. Dave, if you find this, don't tell Jack." "All right, just listen." It was Tommy Geller. You could hear the tension in his breath. He wasn't joking around. He said they'd been checking the storage drain behind the back lot after a heavy rain. Mark thought there was a crawl space beneath it sealed up, but maybe still accessible. They'd found some old hinges, maybe even a panel, but the concrete was odd, looked newer, like it had been patched over. Tommy said they were going to take another look that night. The tape crackled again. "If I'm wrong, fine. I'll owe you a beer. But if I'm not... If there's something down there, I just want it on record that I said something." There was some background shuffling. Then his voice dropped. "Mark's been on edge. Keeps saying he hears this hum like a generator or a pump. But there's nothing back there. Nothing we can see anyway." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "If we're not back by sunrise, maybe check under the slab." Click. That was it. I didn't move for a while after it ended. The tape wasn't rambling. It wasn't a joke. It was a warning. And if the timeline was right, Tommy recorded it on October 6th, the night before they vanished. I copied the audio twice, then filed the original cassette away. Something about the way he said it under the slab kept looping in my head. I called my cousin Wendy that afternoon and asked if she could still get me inside the property. She said the county had posted a crew notice for continued excavation, but the site was still sealed. The hatch, the one the construction team had uncovered, was bolted now, officially off limits. But I had a contact in Springfield who owed me a favor. I told him I was working on a legacy piece, something about historical oversight, maybe civil record keeping. He called back the next morning. He'd gotten me access to the site for 30 minutes. No digging, no equipment. But I could go in. I signed the waiver, took my camera notebook and flashlight, and headed to the old Gulf station around noon. The building was still there, barely. The awning had collapsed years ago, leaving a rusted frame. The windows were boarded and yellow zoning tape flapped around the west fence line. I didn't bother with the front. I went straight to the back lot where the gravel had thinned out to dirt. The hatch was there, plain as day, steel, new, bolted with a county warning label. It sat just feet from where that witness claimed to have seen a truck parked with its lights off in the early hours of October 7th, 1981. I crouched beside it and ran my hand across the surface. Cold even in the sun. I hesitated, then loosened the bolt. It took some effort, but eventually the hatch gave way with a loud metal groan. I climbed down slowly, maybe 10, 12 feet deep. The ladder was bolted to the wall, newer than the rest of the space. The room itself was bare concrete. No piping, no shelving, just 4 gray walls and a hard floor. My flashlight swept across the far corner where 3 items had been tagged and left in a sealed evidence bag. A name tag bent and rusted David, a digital watch frozen at 1:56 a.m., and a chipped lighter with Missouri's motto, "Show me state," still faintly visible. There were no human remains, no blood, just absence, and the impression of something once present. I turned toward the ladder to head out, but stopped when I saw something near the base. A faded mark on the wall written in black marker. A single number, 4. I stared at it for a long time. There were only 3 men who disappeared. So what or who was the 4th? On the wall opposite, just above the floor, I found a cluster of scratch marks. Not random, deliberate. 4 vertical tallies, 1 cross-cutting. A count. Someone had kept track of time or maybe people. I didn't know. But it wasn't graffiti. It was from inside. I snapped a photo, stepped back, and looked at the floor. It was too clean. No dust, no debris, no signs of storage. This room wasn't meant for supplies. It was meant for something else. I climbed back up, slowly rebolted the hatch, and walked back to my car without saying a word. That night, I went through the rest of the crate from my uncle's attic. Most of it was old paperwork, a few photos, some of them curling at the corners. But tucked inside a folded receipt was a note written in David's handwriting. Just a few lines written fast, black ink, bleeding slightly into the paper. 4 turns left from light. Tap twice, then push. 12 in 4 down. Numbers lie. Names don't. If it's not shut, don't go in. I read it twice before I understood what it might be. Not a message. Not a journal. Instructions. I didn't know for what. But something about that lighter, that watch frozen at 1:56, and that number 4 on the wall, all of it pointed to something hidden deeper than anyone had ever looked. I copied the note, slipped the original back into the envelope, and stared at it under the lamp for a long time. The next morning, I made a call to a retired utility worker named Dennis Pike. He'd worked on stormwater systems in the area for years. I asked if he'd be willing to help me track down old sewer maps from the 50s and 60s. He said they'd be in the Darlow Water Board archives. Most weren't digitized. We'd have to go in person. We met 2 days later in a warehouse near the edge of town. The basement smelled like paper and mildew. Rows of blueprints, some still rolled tight, others sagging from moisture. We found what we were looking for under a heavy cardboard sleeve labeled 1952 to 1964. There it was. A secondary storm access tunnel running beneath what would later become the Gulf Station. The note on the map said it had been closed in '64, but there was no record of it being filled. Just one small red circle drawn in pencil near the eastern edge. Next to it, in faint print, "Do not dig." Dennis tapped the page once, then looked at me. "That's not a public marking. That's something a contractor wrote. Quietly." I took a photo of the map and rolled it up carefully. If that tunnel had never been sealed, and if that slab really had been added later as Mercer suspected, then whatever David and the others found wasn't just strange. It was older than the station itself, and someone at some point decided it was better left underground. That night I pulled out the flashlight, the photo, and David's instructions. 4 turns left. Tap twice. Then push. 12 in. 4 down. If it's not shut, don't go in. I read it out loud slowly, and for the first time since I'd come back to Darlow, I realized I wasn't trying to solve a disappearance. I was trying to open a door that someone had built a town around just to forget. It took nearly a week to line up access to the secondary drainage line. Dennis had to pull a few strings with a guy he used to work with, retired now, but still with enough clout to get us in without raising red flags. I told myself it was just exploratory, just mapping, but I packed like it wasn't. 2 flashlights, spare batteries, knee pads, gloves, a folding knife, and a half roll of fluorescent flag tape. I didn't tell anyone where I was going except Wendy, and even then I was vague. I said I was looking into a utilities discrepancy behind the old service corridor, and she didn't press. I think she knew not to. Dennis picked me up just before 6 a.m. The entrance we needed was about a mile west of the Gulf property, hidden behind a fenced-off maintenance path. The gate was old and rusted, but the padlock had been changed recently, something that caught Dennis's eye. Funny, he said, jiggling the latch. They stopped servicing this line in the 80s. Why lock it now, I didn't answer. He got it open in less than a minute. The tunnel sloped down, quick, brick-lined damp, the air stale but not unbearable. We walked for maybe 10 minutes in silence, our footsteps echoing against the low ceiling. The map from the archives showed a maintenance chamber about 200 feet in. Just past that, the tunnel was supposed to split with a stub marked non-access. But when we got there, that stub wasn't sealed like the others. It had a steel door recessed into the wall with a handle worn smooth from use. No markings, no sealant. Just a door in the dark that wasn't supposed to be there. Dennis stood a few feet back while I stepped forward and gave it a push. It didn't budge at first, but then I remembered the note. 4 turns left from light. Tap twice. Then push. I scanned the low ceiling for anything resembling a fixture. There, faint and covered in sediment, was an old rusted sconce, no longer wired but still intact. I counted 4 slow turns left from its position, then tapped the brick wall twice with the flat of my hand. Nothing happened. But when I leaned into the door again, it gave. The hinges groaned like something waking up. What we saw inside wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a tunnel. It was a chamber, low and wide, maybe 20 by 30 feet, reinforced with crossbeams and poured concrete. The air was colder here. Still, in the corner, stacked against one wall, were 4 large metal drums, unlabeled, sealed. Dennis didn't move. I stepped in slowly, scanning with my flashlight. The far wall was covered in something blackened, maybe soot, maybe mold, but beneath it faint outlines of old chalk markings were still visible. And in the center of the room sat a wooden chair, not broken, not discarded, positioned, like someone had been waiting in it, or sent there. It faced the corner, not the door. On the floor beneath it were drag marks, short like the chair had been moved a few inches, then stopped. I crouched and looked closer. The scuff patterns weren't random. They looped, hesitated, resumed. Someone had been tied there, and they'd tried to move. Dennis stepped in behind me, his voice low. "We need to call this in." I didn't argue. I stood up, turned around, then froze. There was writing above the doorway, faded but still legible. "If it's not shut, don't go in." The same line from David's note. My breath caught. I didn't feel afraid exactly, just locked in a kind of quiet disbelief. Like we'd opened something that had been meant to stay sealed, not just for safety, but because whoever left that message knew what this place really was. I photographed the room, every corner. The drums, the chair, the markings. Dennis didn't touch anything, and neither did I. We backed out the same way we came. By the time we reached the surface, the light had changed. It was nearly 8:30 a.m., and the sun had broken through the clouds. But the feeling didn't lift. I filed a report through an anonymous tip line that evening using a burner number. I gave them the location, the approximate coordinates, and a brief list of what we'd found. I didn't leave my name. But 2 days later I saw a marked vehicle parked by the fence. Then another. Then the gate was resealed this time with county tape and a full bolt lock. The next day I got a call from Wendy. She sounded rattled. She said 2 men in plain clothes had shown up at the municipal office asking questions about recent access logs. She hadn't mentioned me, but they knew someone had used an outdated utility badge. "They're not local," she said. "And they're not asking the right kind of questions." That night I went back through every page of the Gulf redevelopment proposal. Near the back, in a line item about soil remediation, was a subcontractor listing I'd skimmed before Rydell Partners. That name meant nothing to me at first. But when I checked the registry, I found a defunct holding address in Kansas City. The LLC had been dissolved in 2004. The contact listed Richard Geller, Mark's older brother. I hadn't even known Mark had a brother. But there it was. He'd signed the remediation waiver in 1998. The same year, the county quietly decommissioned the service corridor. I printed out the document, stared at the signature, and wrote his name down in the margin, Richard Geller. If he was still alive, he wasn't in Missouri anymore. I started making calls, archives, business records, a few people who owed me favors, and I started hearing rumors about a contractor who'd worked flood control in the late 90s, bought up a handful of abandoned parcels, then disappeared after a permit dispute with the state. One source said he'd been in Arizona. Another said Colorado. No one had seen him in years. But the records were there. Signatures, maps, transfer receipts. Richard Geller had known about the hatch. He'd had access. And in 1998, he'd paid to have that chamber sealed without official inspection. Not filled, just covered. I sat with that for a long time. I looked back at the photo of the chalk marks on the wall. Someone had written names in that room. Faint, but there, David. Mark, Tommy, and then below them a fourth name. I couldn't read it fully. Just the first three letters, R-I-C. I printed the photo, circled the name, and pinned it to the wall above my desk. Then I crossed off three names, and under the fourth, I wrote a single word, still here. I found Richard Geller's last known address and a property file from '03 buried under a holding company that had gone inactive 6 months after its founding. The lot was about 30 miles outside Flagstaff Remote up a gravel incline past a shuttered mining road. I didn't go right away. I sat with the file for almost a week. Something about the photo of the chalk names in the chamber kept drawing me back. David, Mark, Tommy, then the half-erased R.I.C. It wasn't conclusive, not legally, not even enough for a formal inquiry. But it was enough to push me. I left early that Sunday just after sunrise. The road was mostly intact until the last quarter mile where it turned to uneven rock. The cabin sat low in a clearing, pitched roof, faded blue trim, and a sun-bleached truck parked crooked in the dirt beside it. No mailbox, no curtains. The place looked abandoned, but there was a propane tank beside the porch that still had its cap secured and fresh tire marks in the mud near the side deck. I stayed in the car for a few minutes, just watching. Nothing moved. The air was still. I approached slowly, boots crunching through dry pine needles, flashlight in one pocket, recorder in the other. The front door was warped from sun exposure, but it wasn't locked. I knocked anyway. Waited. Then eased it open with the edge of my boot. The interior was cooler than I expected, musty but not rotten. A cot in the corner. A metal desk. An old military-style footlocker with reinforced corners. And on the far wall, neatly pinned above the desk, were 6 paper maps. Local watershed layouts, some dating back to the early 70s. All marked up in red pencil. I stepped closer and saw familiar labels, county line culverts, water control valves, secondary runoff channels. Some crossed out. Some circled. One of them matched the same chamber Dennis and I had entered. It had been labeled simply R1E. I took a photo, then opened the desk drawers one by one. In the third drawer down was a folder. Inside, several faded incident reports, all from the late 90s. One caught my attention immediately. It described a deep shaft contamination risk near the redevelopment zone, later amended to natural sinkhole. But someone, Richard Warshasum, had handwritten a correction beside the margin. False. No collapse. Access closed under advisement. There were no signatures, no agency stamps, just typewritten sheets with field codes and internal notations. Whoever had assembled this wasn't filing anything official. They were keeping track. I didn't take anything from the cabin. I photographed each page. By the time I stepped back outside, the light had shifted behind the trees, and the air had that stillness I've come to associate with being watched. I didn't see anyone, but a dust pattern on the side of my car told me someone had passed by while I was inside. A finger swipe clear across the rear windshield. Just one. I drove back into town and called Wendy from a diner off the interstate. She picked up on the second ring. I told her I had something I needed her to see, and she said she could meet the next morning before work. We sat in her office just after 7, blinds still drawn, her hands clasped as she leaned over the photos I'd printed. When she saw the map, her face changed. Not panic, something else. Recognition. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she asked if I knew the name Lloyd Harper. I didn't. She pulled a file from a locked drawer and laid it flat. Lloyd had been the flood safety director from 1994 to 2001. His name was on several early-phase redevelopment memos, then abruptly vanished from the record. No retirement notice, no reassignment, just gone. But there had been a quiet settlement the year he left. Wendy showed me the ledger entry coded as a voluntary resignation adjustment. It wasn't much, just under $12,000, but it lined up with the date Richard Geller submitted his final subcontractor invoice. It wasn't a coincidence. I took a long breath and said what neither of us wanted to say. Someone had buried access to that chamber, not to hide a hazard, to hide the use of it. And Richard Geller hadn't done it alone. Wendy agreed to run a full parcel history on the adjacent plots, but she warned me most of the documents had been transferred to microfilm storage, and anything before 95 might be spotty. That afternoon, I started getting phone calls from an unknown number. No voicemails. Just one ring, then nothing. Then again an hour later. I ignored them at first. Then, just after 8 that evening, someone knocked on my front door. I live in a basement duplex. You don't get surprise visitors out here. I moved quietly to the peephole and saw a man in a dark windbreaker. Mid-50s, average height, no badge, no clipboard, no car in view. He didn't knock again, just stood there, maybe 2 minutes. Then walked off without saying a word. I waited until he was fully gone, then stepped outside and checked the side gate. The latch had been clipped and set back to look intact. I didn't sleep that night, just sat at the table with the folder open listening. That's when I remembered something I'd overlooked back when I visited Mark Geller's mother. There'd been a photo on the mantel, a family photo from what looked like the late 80s. I'd glanced at it, taken note of Mark's younger self, but now I saw it differently. There had been 4 people in the photo, a woman, 2 boys, and a man standing slightly apart, his posture rigid, hand on the older boy's shoulder, not Mark's. I zoomed in. The older boy was Richard, and the younger boy, maybe 7 or 8, was Tommy, not just a neighbor, not a classmate, a relative, possibly a cousin, possibly more. It recontextualized everything. The chalked names in the chamber, the shared last summer, the last walk before Tommy disappeared. They weren't random. They were chosen. And now I had to find out who had been choosing them. I opened my laptop and created a new folder. I labeled it Pattern 1. The next morning, I drove back to the records annex and asked to pull parcel logs, not just for Geller's cabin property, but for every lot within a half-mile radius of the R1E culvert. The clerk didn't ask questions. She just handed me a clipboard and directed me to a side room with a microfilm reader and a box labeled County Surface Easements, 1980 to 1997. It took hours. Most of the filings were routine easement shifts, drainage permissions, plat redraws. But one form caught my attention. It was dated July 17, 1989, submitted by a limited partnership called LMLS Holdings. It referenced a parcel about a quarter-mile south of R1E, one that had never come up in our earlier map overlays. The claim listed temporary environmental stabilization as the stated purpose and cited a multi-year access agreement with the Army Corps of Engineers signed and then sealed under a secondary project code 1 I didn't recognize. I took a photo and sent it to Wendy. She called me back within 15 minutes. The project code had been used for a federal emergency backfill program after a late 80s flash flood technically separate from the city's redevelopment push, but routed through the same planning office. The key detail was this: the backfill wasn't to prevent water damage. It was to close out unsanctioned excavation sites. She paused, then added, "The internal note on that record reads, 'See prior Child Protective Services closure.'" I felt something tighten behind my eyes when she said it, because there it was, stated however vaguely. Children had been involved. The same year Richard Geller was supposedly working off book. The same year Tommy Harper disappeared. The same rough location. Wendy said she'd try to request the redacted CPS file through a state liaison, but she warned it could take weeks, even months. In the meantime, I drove out to the parcel itself. It was harder to access than the cabin had been overgrown with tamarisk and shaded by a natural rock ridge. But after a few tries, I found the old service track. The land was still scarred. You could see where something circular had been filled in a depression maybe 30 feet across, now covered in riverstone and wild grass. I walked the perimeter slowly, listening. It was dead quiet out there. Just wind and the crunch of gravel under my boots. Then, as I turned back toward the ridge, I saw it something half buried in the loam. I crouched and brushed it clear. A metal plate. 8 inches wide, 4 inches high. Stamped with the number 2407. It wasn't bolted in. It had been driven partway down like a marker. I photographed it, then turned it over. The back had a scratched surface light like a wire brush had scuffed off something that used to be there. A serial code, maybe. I didn't move anything else. Just stood and looked around that clearing, suddenly aware that I wasn't alone. Not in the physical sense, I didn't see or hear anyone, but in the way the air held. Still alert, as if watching back. I returned to my car and sat there for almost a full minute before starting the engine. That night I went through every name I could find connected to the Harper family, distant cousins, old neighbors, people who might have intersected with Tommy in those years. I wasn't looking for someone obvious. I was looking for a link that had slipped under radar. Around 11, I found it. A woman named Darla Flint. She'd lived 2 houses over from the Gellers in 1986. Moved away 6 months later after what had been listed as a domestic disturbance call. No charges filed. But her statement, preserved in a scanned incident log, had mentioned boys running through the ditch tunnels again and screaming like something got them. I looked her up. She was still alive, 62, living in a care facility outside Phoenix. I called the administrator the next morning and requested a visit. 2 days later, I sat across from her in a small rec room with a humming air unit overhead. She looked at the photo I brought, the one of the chamber with the chalk names, and said quietly, "That's the culvert behind the maintenance yard, isn't it?" I nodded. She tapped the photo with a shaky finger. I used to hear them. Summer nights, around twilight. Richard would lead and the others would follow. Always boys, always young. I asked if she remembered Tommy. She did. Said he'd been quiet, but smart. Smarter than the others. That's probably why she didn't finish the sentence. Just looked past me. Then she said something I wrote down word for word. They weren't playing. They were rehearsing. I asked what she meant, but she didn't elaborate. Just repeated the word rehearsing. I thanked her and left heart beating too loud in my ears. When I got home, there was a new voicemail. Blocked number. The voice was male, mid-range, deliberate. Just one sentence. "You're asking the wrong people the right questions." Then the line went dead. I sat there in the dark for a while. Then opened the photo again. The chalk names. The fourth one, faint, almost scrubbed out. It wasn't RIC. It was Ricky. I zoomed closer. The Y was there, angled off the edge of the frame. Not a marking. A name. And maybe not the name of a victim. I opened a new note and typed a single question. Had Richard Geller left his own name in the chamber, or had someone else done it for him? I spent the next 2 days doing what you do when the trail starts to circle itself. You go quiet. You stop chasing forward and start tracing backward carefully, like you're unpicking something hand-stitched in panic. I pulled my earlier interviews with Paul Vargas, the former ground supervisor who'd mentioned the cold iron plates found near R1E. I hadn't thought much of it then, but now I kept turning over that number 2407 stamped into the one I found near the old backfill site. It didn't match any public works designation I could trace, but there was a narrow line in one of the scanned county invoices from 1989 listed under non-reusable inventory. 24 plates ordered for the Environmental Stabilization Project delivered to a temporary depot, Depot 24. I didn't even know we had a Depot 24. Wendy confirmed it was real, but short-lived. A leased warehouse 2 counties over used for just under 18 months before being shuttered without official decommission. That gave me somewhere to go. The address led to a plain cinder block structure set back off a service road behind an old rail spur. Nothing marked. Chain-link fence cut open long ago. It was nearly empty inside except for some broken shelving, a few pallets, and a half-collapsed file cabinet. I walked slow. Dust clung to the light like gauze. It was the kind of space that feels less abandoned than paused. On the far wall behind a rusted breaker panel, I found a section of drywall that had been patched and painted clumsily, like someone wasn't planning for visitors. I pressed my palm to it. It gave a little under the pressure. Hollow. I didn't break through, but I marked it on my phone and left. That night I called someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a year. Eli Langan, a retired deputy with a habit of digging into old stories. He used to log his own files on cold juvenile cases, just in case the system forgot the names. I told him what I'd found and asked if he remembered any reference to kids disappearing from the floodplain zone. Kids who weren't listed, maybe never reported. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You still working the Geller angle?" I said yes. Long pause. Then, "There's one kid. He didn't have much. Just a note from a 1991 intake form foster boy temporarily housed with a step relative near the old utility easement. Went missing on a Sunday, came back the next morning barefoot, dehydrated, and refusing to speak. Never placed again. Disappeared for good 2 weeks later. The name was Brian Edgecombe, 11 years old. I asked Eli to send me whatever he had. He said it was barely a paragraph, but he'd try. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went back to Depot 24 with a pry bar and a crowbar. The drywall came away easy. Behind it was a void about 4 feet wide, floor to ceiling, with nothing but a plastic crate and a ring of paint discoloration on the concrete like something had once been bolted there. Inside the crate were file folders, maybe a dozen, each one marked with a number. None of them labeled as names, just sequences E310, T144, B222. The fourth one down was marked R407. I opened it. Inside were 4 pages. A Polaroid faded and scratched showing what looked like a boy standing next to a rusted culvert pipe. I couldn't tell how old he was. Maybe 10, maybe 12. Shirtless, looking down. There was no date, just the letters OBT Test 2 written across the bottom. The next page was a crude floor plan. A circle labeled Ring, another labeled Observation, and a third marked Record. All of it drawn on letterhead from a defunct construction subcontractor, one that had folded in 1990 and been tied briefly to the core environmental closure bids. The last 2 pages were blank, but when I held one to the light, I saw it faint outlines of an impression left by something written and torn away. I didn't try to decipher it right then. I just sat on the floor of that warehouse and stared at the file in my hands. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as an incomplete investigation and started understanding it as a contained one. Not hidden by chance, but built to vanish in layers. I sent digital copies to Wendy. She didn't call. She came straight to my apartment. We sat at my kitchen table and just looked at each other for a while. Then she said, "You know what OBT stands for?" I shook my head. She pulled up a scan from a 1988 municipal training manual buried deep in the archive. OBT observed behavioral threshold, a phrase used during unofficial field trials for juvenile stress response, not clinical, not legal, just bureaucratic enough to disappear. We were quiet a long time. Then she asked, "Do you think this is where Tommy ended?" I said I didn't know, but if it wasn't, it was where something began. As she left, she handed me a slip of paper. One more name. Someone she hadn't told me about before. Someone who used to sign for field material at the now-erased Depot 24. A logistics technician named Henry Calder. Last known address in Clovis. No phone, no email. Just a mailing box and a street number. I folded the paper and slipped it into my wallet. I didn't decide to drive out there until 3 days later. Something held me back. Maybe it was the Polaroid. Maybe it was the impression I'd copied from the blank page still taped to my wall, faint lines reading, "Bring one who won't be missed." Or maybe it was just knowing that this was the point where whatever I found couldn't be undone. I found Henry Calder sitting in a folding chair behind a bait shop just west of Clovis. He looked older than his file photo, mid-70s maybe, but sharp-eyed. Didn't flinch when I said my name, just nodded like he'd been waiting for someone to come looking. He wouldn't speak until we were inside. Closed the back door, pulled the blinds, and sat back down without offering me a seat. Then he said, there was no program. Just a contract. No one thought it'd last. And maybe it didn't. I didn't interrupt. He talked slow like every word cost something. Said the plates, the numbered ones, weren't for equipment. They were behavioral markers, used to calibrate environmental thresholds under stress. I asked what kind of stress. He looked away and said, "The kind you don't come back from right." I showed him the photo from the R407 file. He didn't touch it, just stared and said, "That one broke protocol. We weren't supposed to see the faces." When I asked about Tommy, he paused, then said softly, "That name's not in my logs." I wanted to press, but something about the way he said it told me not to, like it was both truth and refusal. I asked him why he stayed quiet all these years. He shrugged. "We thought we were helping, that it was temporary. Then it wasn't." Before I left, he handed me a small box of index cards. Said he couldn't throw them out, but he didn't want them anymore. Back home, I spent the night reading every line. Most were codes, shift logs, material orders. But one card had a name, Brian Edgecombe. Below it, a single word in pencil reassigned. That word sat with me in a way I can't explain. Not fired, not placed. Just moved. Erased from one list added to another. I sent the card to Wendy. She hasn't written back yet, but I know she's still digging. We both are in our own ways. The last thing I did before closing this out was visit the culvert, the same one from the photo. I found it 2 miles north of the old R1E site, still there, half choked with weeds. I didn't go in, just stood at the mouth and listened. Long enough to know it's not the kind of place that forgets easily. Long enough to understand why someone might have gone quiet afterward. I don't know what happened to Tommy Geller. I don't know if he ever made it out of that ring or if he was even in it to begin with. But I know his name brought light to a darkness that had settled too deep for most to see. And sometimes that's what memory is. Not justice, not closure. Just the act of saying a name out loud so the silence doesn't win. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll remember Tommy, or Brian, or any of the others whose names were turned into numbers. You don't have to believe every part. You just have to remember that someone was here, someone who mattered. And if you feel like sharing this, do it for them so no one disappears alone.